Well, good afternoon and welcome to our In Conversation event with David Crisafulli. Can I begin by acknowledging that we're here today meeting on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Can I also pay my deep respects to all First Nations people joining us on the call today and to the traditional owners of the lands all across Queensland. I want to welcome you all to this really exciting conversation today with the opposition leader, David Crisafulli. We're getting really close to the state election on the 26th of October, so it is a real privilege, really, to have David with us. And today we're going to have, hopefully, quite a wide-ranging conversation about David, the things that brought him into politics and drive him to want to be the Premier of the state, and some of those things that are very dear to our heart in the community services sector, including the sector itself, and then the policies that will make really big changes across our communities in Queensland. I'll just let you know that we are broadcasting in Zoom. We are accepting questions, although I do have tons of questions received already, and I'm going to try and weave them through the conversation today. We also will be recording the session and making it available for people afterwards. So really, our guest today doesn't need much introduction. We all know David Crisafulli, but there's some really interesting things in his bio. So many of you would know that David started out his career as a journalist, and as I understand it, first job at the Herbert Express,
well done.
And then over to Win in Townsville. He moved from that to a role as media advisor for then Liberal Senator Ian McDonald, and it wasn't long after that he entered politics, and he became the youngest person elected to Townsville Local Council. He then went on to be Deputy Mayor, and then he took a leap into state politics, and he was elected into state politics in 2012. David then went on to become a Minister for Local Government. He took on community recovery and resilience portfolios. Then in 2015, with the defeat of the Newman government, David lost his seat, only to return back in 2017 as member for Broadwater on the Gold Coast. And since 2020, he has been the opposition leader. I also really want to emphasise here that particularly since David has been opposition leader, he has been a really engaged opposition leader with QCOSS. We've enjoyed a really constructive and consistent relationship. And so it's with real pleasure that I welcome you here today, and thanks so much for joining us, David.
Amy, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and to those dialing in, particularly those who work in the sector, thank you very much for what you do. So
can we start with you? So thinking back to the boy who grew up on the Herbert River, far north Queensland, how does that boy show up today in your leadership?
It's everything. I'm only here because of the product of a migrant story, and I always say, no matter what I achieve in my life, I always believe it'll run a distant second to my late grandfather, who picked up his life from the other side of the world and came to a country that he didn't speak a word of English. He left his wife and 3 kids back home to come over and get the money to bring them over. So that took nearly 12 months. And I just think about what that would be like in that era. No mobile phones, no emails, the odd letter, send money back home in the hope that it made it back. And incredible stories. And my grandfather was about late 30s when he came over. My dad was 9 when he migrated the year after. And my parents still farm that property today. So there's a lot of that little boy, that country kid still there. So to see what my grandfather saved up, bought a little farm, and then Dad's taken it and turned it into a larger farming enterprise. I'm really proud of them. I really am. And I love the migrant success story, which is why I'm someone, I embrace the migrant story. I love multiculturalism, and I think we're a much better country and a much better state because of it.
You never were tempted to become a farmer?
My dad says politics is Hollywood for ugly people. Yes. And he always says that eventually one day I'm going to come to my senses and go back home to the farm. I do miss it. I do miss an element of that open spaces and a simple life. It's. I have to say, my parents are two of the happiest people I know. But they love their life on the farm. My dad's idea of a holiday, when we first moved to the coast, Mum and Dad came down to see where we were, and I said to Dad, I can take you wherever you like. I can take you to Dreamworld. If you want to go take you to Burleigh, it's really, really nice. Or do you want to go and have a lunch here? We've got a lovely lunch here at Hope Island. He said, I hear there's cane at this place called Jacob's Well. So my dad was on holidays on the Gold Coast and driving around cane fields. So
right.
That tells you
that does tell us
That tells
a lot.
you his interest.
It does.
Okay.
And I think, before we get into the crux of it, I think one of the things that anyone who's spent time around you, David, would know is that you really light up when you start talking about food and coffee.
Yes.
And so for a very controversial question, I want to know, what are your hot tips? Where to get the best coffee in Queensland? Where to get the best steak?
You said there'd be no tough questions. It's like asking, what's your favourite child? I'm bound to offend a lot. Here goes. Coffee, if you're in Toowoomba, there's a great little coffee shop down a laneway called Ground Up Espresso. Really, really good place. What else have I got? In Ingham, my hometown, JK's Deli, that's pretty special. Best steak, great steakhouse. Great steakhouse on Palmer Street in Townsville. There's a great steakhouse in the valley, which is called SK's. That's remarkable. But I love the steak at a pub. I love a counter meal. I love a nice rump steak every day of the week. Bit of pepper sauce, some chips, which I'll pretend not to eat, and then I eat them all and end up eating other people's as well.
Yes. I feel like I'm at risk at asking too many food questions, so I'm going to move on.
The real stuff.
It is. So this week, QCOSS released our State of the Sector report, which you have there. It tells the story of the sector. We produce one every year. It's the result of travelling around the state and talking to workers at town halls really across the state, and then we do a survey. There's over 1,000 voices in that report talking about the state we're in. What we can see is that only 8% of services are saying they can meet demand. And one of the really big challenges we have right now and into the future is attracting and retaining the workforce they need. Yeah. I know you've got the report there, David. Yeah. What were some of the things that stood out for you?
Well, I also have to acknowledge the way that when you were putting this together, you dealt with us as well. And I think your members need to know that I just think that's a really constructive relationship, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. When you think that 1 in 12 don't believe they're adequately resourced, we've got problems. And I think the other thing in the report that really struck me is the percentage of people who've never asked for services before who are first-time users. And I've seen that as well. When you go to the food relief places, and I was at one in Logan the other day, you're seeing people who are arriving, and they're arriving, and you can tell it's the first time they've reached out, and that is an increasing story. I've travelled a lot in regional Queensland over many years. I've never seen the level of tents in all major centres, under bridges, under shelters, in creek banks, and that tells you that there is a growing homelessness contingent, and there's an element of that growing homelessness contingent which obviously have got mental health challenges, etc. There's another element where people are working, they're going to work, and they're unable to get housing, and that's really, really tough, and it's a growing challenge, and your report highlights those pressures.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we talk about in the report is some of the reform that's currently underway. Years of advocacy by our amazing members, many of who are online today, pulling together a really good evidence base to show that there's some systemic issues that are causing issues for us attracting and retaining workforce, and therefore delivering excellence in our communities. And that comes down to stuff to do with contracting and procurement. There's a process on foot at the moment within Treasury to implement the principles the Queensland Government have committed to around 5-year contracts, contract renewal times, indexation, as just some examples. I guess for us, it's really important to hear from you, should you form government after the 26th of October, is that reform something that you would commit to?
And I hope you saw, as part of the budget process, our commitment to the specialist homelessness, the uplift there, the longevity of that. It is, Amy, and the reason why those principles are important is the sector in many cases are struggling to attract and retain people, full stop, because there's such pressure in the job market. If you don't have long-term contracts and people who are well paid and have good conditions, productivity is also vital, of course, all the way through. But if you don't have those things, you're not going to be able to attract and retain. And in the end, it ends up costing you more financially and socially if there's a churn through those. So I'm a big believer in a couple of things, and you've highlighted one, which is the longer contracts, but it's also when contract renewals are occurring as well. They've got to be done well before. It can't be in the last couple of months window, because otherwise people have got kids to get to school, and in some cases they might have mortgages, or they've got to take a lease on a property based on where they're working. All of those things are impacted if people don't have security of workforce. Employment underpins everything. A job is dignity, and a job is a connectivity with a community. And if you don't have that certainty, it doesn't work. And I've seen that model before, that organisations going with the begging bowl every year or even every 2 years, it doesn't work. You're better off offering a long-term provision. So the answer is yes, we are committed.
So that's wonderful to hear clearly that an LNP government would commit to those procurement principles.
Yeah, well, I want the following, and I think the majority of unions want the same thing. Workers to be well paid, for them to be safe, either safe in their employment or safe on their work site, productivity to be honoured, and contracts to be adhered to. And I know there's been a lot of talk about what things need to be called, etc. That to me is not the main issue. The main issue is about security of employment. And if we can get that, I do believe that actually helps the sector long term. And I have a big focus on productivity, and I think I think the majority of Queenslanders share the same view. If we have productive workforces, that helps in the service provision, and it helps in that sense of satisfaction as well. And I think in many cases, I look at some of the challenges that Queensland faces around some of those service delivery, and I think security of workforce, better laws and resourcing, and a focus on productivity can lead to a lot of repair in those areas.
Well, can I thank you for that, because I think hearing that sort of commitment from you in relation to those principles is really, really important for our members. And so thank you for giving us that assurance. It might be uncomfortable, but I'm going to bring in sort of the sort of ghost, I guess, of the Newman government.
It's necessary. It's necessary to discuss.
And, there is a really genuine fear in our sector about cuts. I know that you've addressed publicly the issue about cuts when it comes to the public sector, but our sector itself felt that and was also experienced cuts. And so I wanted to hear from you today whether you'd commit to not cutting the funding of community services where there's no issues with the service that's being provided.
Let me give you the definitive answer, and then I'll unpack it a little further. The definitive answer is yes, there won't be, and in fact, I want to go a step further and offer those longer term security. Now, of course, you always have to make sure that when people sign a contract that an entity or an organisation adheres to it. I think that's a guiding principle. But you do need continuity, and you do need that stability. In answer to the obvious question, and I am glad you've given me the opportunity for it, those things didn't work. They didn't work financially, but they also didn't work socially either. And you mentioned the public service and your sector as well, but I look at what happened in that period, and it didn't work on either of those fronts. And I guess, I saw that, and I saw the backlash of the community. And so from a political point of view, message received, but from a personal point of view, it didn't achieve either of those things.
Yeah. So can we look back to the observations you made around housing?
Yeah.
And thank you for the commitment you made during budget week to deliver on the same social housing targets, but 2 years earlier.
Oh, a little better than that. 10,000 more, actually.
Right.
Yep.
And I'm interested to know, like, that is such an important commitment, and I think gave a lot of assurance to the sector that this important work will happen. These are big targets. We all need to be committed to them. But I am also wondering about the third of Queenslanders who rent.
Yeah.
And, you've seen it yourself, travelling around the state, rent is not affordable for so many people right now. What do you think the answer to that is?
It's a little more than a third who rents now in Queensland. Home ownership's at 63.5%, so it's a little north of that. So I genuinely believe if we can get the mechanics right of the housing market, and that involves getting more houses, that will help. I do believe that. And I also think the fact that as a state we haven't delivered social and community housing also has contributed to what we've seen at the bottom end of the market. And we won't agree on some of the metrics around rent capping. That's not something that philosophically I agree with. I certainly respect the way you advocate for it, but I don't agree with it, because I think long term that won't lead to where we need to be. What's happened in Queensland, and look, across the country, but Queensland, to me, Queensland's got a few of those markers that show that we are under more pressure here than anywhere else. And if I have a look at the figures in the last 10 years, there's been 29% less land released year on year. Now that has meant that you've got people moving here in droves, and you don't have the houses for them. And as a result, you've got this competition, particularly at the bottom end of the market, that has this cascading effect that is putting so much pressure on people. And people are genuinely fearful of what happens when their rental term comes to the end. Now, we've supported some of the changes that have been made around that, around increasing rents over a 12-month period, etc. But the missing piece in the puzzle is the supply element. 3 years ago in Queensland, the government announced what was called the $2 billion Housing Investment Fund. That's 3 years ago now. There's not one Queenslander living in a new home built under that. I need to unpack that. 3 years, $2 billion, not one new dwelling has been built. There's a couple of hundred under construction, but a couple of hundred after 3 years. So the commitment I've made is that fund, every cent is going to be used to deliver new supply. And there is an argument for government to buy existing properties from time to time where there is a failing in the market, absolutely. But that fund was designed about getting more social housing, and it hasn't delivered. I'm also a supporter of the community housing sector, and we are the only state that's gone backwards in the last 10 years in that regard. I think they are a sleeping giant. You've got some very good providers here in Queensland that, with a bit of help, could work their balance sheets to deliver more supply as well. So I think that's a way of helping the most vulnerable. The way to help the broader population, we've got to get more supply. And I've also spoken about a partnership with council to fund some infrastructure which does that. I want to create competition. And I know for many of the people who your service providers help, the idea of home ownership would be the furthest thing from their mind at the moment when they're genuinely struggling to feed their kids. But I do want a Queensland where people cannot believe they'll own a home again one day. And I think if someone's working, they do have the right to be able to aspire for that. And I mentioned we've got the lowest home ownership rate in the country, and I'm always mindful of that. Home ownership won't be for everybody, but I do want particularly people who've never owned a home to believe that they can do that again.
Do you think there's, because I think it's well accepted, I think, that supply is the answer to resolving the housing crisis. But there's also it's going to take us time to get where we need to be. Are there things that you would be willing to do as an interim measure to support renters?
I'll never stand in the way of cost relief measures, never will, and I use electricity rebates as a classic example. We fully support that. Right now people need it, and they need it more than ever, but you've got to deal with the structural issues as well, otherwise you'll run out of room. You've got to deal with the reasons why your power prices keep going, and the same things with rent. So I'll never stand in the way of short-term relief and looking at anything that can give that relief, because otherwise you're going to have people sleeping rough. But likewise, I still believe the supply argument's the missing piece, and you are right. It's something that transcends. Most Queenslanders get that. I'm not of the view that it's not something that can't happen a little quicker than what we've been told, though. It's not going to be an overnight fix, but I think you can see a good climb out of it in a reasonable period, including, and we mentioned you sold me 10,000 dwellings short before, so I have to pick up. So we said 53,500 new social homes by 2044, which is a larger target and a little bit earlier than what's currently pegged. And there's a sleeping giant in the faith-based sector who've come to us, and I know many of your members are in that sector. Many of the church and faith-based groups believe that they have surplus land with a simple change of regulation would allow them to put community housing or social housing on their land, a community housing model like that. I look at it, that helping people is the core business for those groups. That makes sense. And I'm not saying you'd compromise the planning scheme. The planning scheme is still in place, but you're dealing with, in some cases, big tracts of land in really good locations. Why doesn't someone have the dignity of living in a home in a place like that? And in many cases, part of their land already used for that. I spoke to somebody the other day who has 18 dwellings and has a similar provision that they could replicate, but under the changes of the planning scheme, they can no longer do that. I see that as an easy fix.
Yeah. So before we move off housing, you said something interesting before in your observations about people who are currently experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, and that was that you observed a group of people where it was sort of a cost of living issue, and also a group of people who have certain characteristics that may make it more difficult to sustain tenancies.
Yeah.
And so, as you'd know, in our sector, we are big advocates of housing with support, supportive housing for groups of people where they do need additional support. And, Common Ground is a fantastic example of that here in Brisbane. I just wanted to get your view on whether you would support an expansion of supportive housing.
Yes, but not with a definitive cap. And I know that has been discussed about a percentage, because what percentages do is they can often mean that you don't deliver enough in areas you do need. Things should be evidence-based, and I am of the view that we are not delivering enough supportive housing. You mentioned Common Ground. I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't mention Rob Mulhock, who's one of our members, who's had a long-term association with them, and so I'm very mindful of what they do. They could fill the proposal that they're talking about on the Gold Coast at the moment, they could fill that 10 times over. So I do believe in the need for more, but I know a lot of the debate in recent times has been around a percentage, and I think our focus should be on meeting need, and that will grow, and I would suggest to you it will grow north of that figure in the years ahead.
So we've had some, exciting news out of National Cabinet today. National Cabinet met, and the agenda was focused on eliminating domestic and family violence, or dealing with violence against women and children. And we saw what I understand to be a new $4.7 billion on the table over the next 5 years from the Commonwealth Government. There is an expectation that the state also does some heavy lifting there. And I guess what we put that against a context of our domestic and family violence services who are out there right now just working so hard, unable to meet the demand in community. So really keen to hear how an LNP government would make sure that the funding goes where it needs to go and really does go to frontline services to support women and children.
Amy, I think the first discussion is how do we guarantee that we get our share of that circa $5 billion that's coming out of the Commonwealth? And if it is new money, as it appears, that's pretty exciting. But I know some of the conversations that's been led today out of the NT, the new Chief Minister there, she's pushing that it be done based on demand rather than population. I think we used that term before about evidence, right? So I would suggest to you that Queensland, if you did a matrix based on demand for domestic and family violence and population, I would suggest we are at the pointy end of needing a help from Canberra. At a state level, we have to be honest. There's a pile of reports, and since Hear Her Voice, there's a pile of reports that stand half a metre tall, and during all of them we've heard the line, this is the line in the sand and this is the line in the sand, and things continue to deteriorate. And I'm not suggesting it's an easy problem to fix. It's not. It's complex, it's societal. Women and children have been badly let down, and by all facets of support structures that haven't been there. But I do think we can do a lot better than what we're doing at the moment. And there are things in those reports, in the dozen plus reports, where deadlines were given and weren't met in a lot of those reports. In fact, I would argue that a big portion of those recommendations we need to continue to work towards. And one of the biggest ones is just getting agencies to talk to each other. And that's everything from the QPS enforcing it to those agencies who are offering support before and after. And I'm not sure there's that connectivity across agencies to do that. And there's certainly not the quantum of money, and your report's highlighted it. That could be a shot in the arm from Canberra. That would really help us financially if we are able to extract a good deal out of that.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting to hear you talk about the parts of the system working well together. In conversations with police, for example, they would say that in order for policing to work, we actually need a strong community services sector to support women and children. And so, is there a commitment to looking at making sure that the resources are there? Yeah,
and I think that's something that both the law enforcement and the sector have agreed on, but there's been a blockade in getting an answer to it. I was speaking with somebody in police the other day who said on any one night there are events that they can't get to, and it shows you that there's a complexity there that's not working. And if you go into any shelter, you'll find that the demand will outstrip supply on most nights. So it shows that something's got to give.
So can we go to youth justice now?
Yeah.
We have heard announcements in this policy area. I think what is particularly interesting to our sector is to understand more about what you're describing as gold standard early intervention and diversion. I want to be a little specific about it though. If you can speak broadly to what that would mean, that would be helpful. But also, I'm really keen to know, and so some of our members who have pre-submitted questions, how that will address the overrepresentation of First Nations kids in our system, and how an LNP government would do something different to start to make it look realistic that we might meet our Close the Gap targets.
Thanks. First, I'll start with the obvious point of difference, and that is the stronger laws that I talk about. And I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention that. I know we don't agree on that. I think that's a really important part of it. We've got a cohort who, have come through a system of a decade of failures from the cradle. And I do believe that without stronger laws, we won't be able to turn that side of the problem around. But I'm not going to give up on kids having an opportunity to a second chance and to try and fix some of those broken structures. So let's go through what that looks like from the end to the beginning. At the moment, when a child is released from youth detention, we've got a 91% reoffending rate in Queensland within 12 months. So just unpack that. There's what's called a 72-hour plan. During the estimates process, we found out that half of the kids don't even get access to a 72-hour plan. Now, if a young offender is released from custody and they don't have anyone even trying to give them structure for 3 days, it's hardly surprising that they're going to find their way back in harm's way. I've committed to a 12-month plan, 6 months intensive, and that's for every single child. Every child that leaves youth detention will have that. Now, I think that's an investment. I think that's a smart financial investment as well as a social one. When you look at what it costs to detain a child in youth detention, I think we owe it to the child and the taxpayer to do something better in that regard. So that will be what we're calling rehabilitation with purpose. But it's also early intervention. And I've been the length and breadth of the state and spoken with a lot of people who are service providers. I can name drop a couple, and by doing so you will see the correlation between what they get, what success they achieve, and their capacity for more. I always mention eSWAV, which is in the neighbouring seat to me on the Gold Coast, but Joe and his team take some of the most complex kids and they've got a success rate approaching 90%. They have received less funding in the last 2 years than what it takes to rehabilitate one child, to accommodate one child in detention for 1 year. Now, there's someone who can turn things around. You mentioned for First Nations children, we need specific programs, and it needs to be programs that give them a sense of self-worth. And I'm not convinced we've done that well enough. There are some issues that we have to address in Indigenous children, full stop, and particularly those kids who are coming out of community, and there's some major challenges there. I went to a fundraising dinner last night for Yulari, which is an amazing organisation which gives kids the chance to go and get educated, and to see a stage full of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who have either just graduated or in the process of graduating. And you talk about closing the gap, these kids are going to be running the state. Oh, it's pretty impressive. That's important. There's another element, and there is a huge overrepresentation of Indigenous kids in residential care and child safety. And this week we've mapped out what I think is the most detailed plan to fix both of those elements. And I would, if your viewers could have a look at it and go and you will see that we're fair income about those two systems that aren't working. When we speak to people working in the residential care sector, and they have been crying out for a dual carer model for a long, long time. We're going to commit to that. We want to have a pathway to give kids the ability to transition into foster care and support those foster carers to do it. We want kids who are in residential care to have access to sport and community groups and to be immersed in a community and feel valued. So we're going to help fund that. I see all of that as an investment. And child safety, we are going to increase the number of officers, and I've set KPIs to do that on a yearly basis. We have to get more people into the department, because what's happening is the ratio of kids to carers continues to go the wrong way. And if you have a look at some of the high profile cases in recent times, the Connolly case is the one that comes to mind, massive failings, and that has been because of a system that is just buckling under pressure. So we've put forward a pretty detailed plan in that, and I think the overrepresentation of First Nations kids in that, I think, is a signal that we must find a way to uplift kids out of that system.
Can we go to the issue of watch houses? So, it wasn't that long ago in this state that it was considered completely inappropriate for children to be held in adult watch houses in Queensland. And now what we have is a practice of holding children as young as 10, children with intellectual impairments in adult watch houses for extended periods of time. What is your view on the use of adult watch houses to detain children?
It's wrong, and you mentioned about there was a time, that was 5 years ago, there was a major story that broke, and the government said we won't be doing this, and we'll be building adequate facilities to stop it from occurring. There are more kids today than when that happened, and more kids that are staying longer. Now, the question is, what is an acceptable time period for that to occur whilst you build the facilities and do the programs to turn kids around? And I do believe a combination of getting early intervention and rehabilitation with purpose, as well as stronger laws to make sure that we're dealing with those who are the ones that need to be dealt with, I do believe that we'll see less of a churn going through the detention centres. At the moment, most often, in fact, I would suggest to you always, there are more kids on remand than being detained. And that's the worst of both worlds. That means that a child is not getting the support or the structure to turn their life around. And then when they are having their day in court, they're not having the consequences, those that did have the bad behaviour. And so the cycle just continues around. And because of that, you're then having watch houses act as de facto detention centres. And they're not. Kids are not designed to be in a watch house for an extended period of time like that. It will break down any form of dignity and getting the child to be able to turn themselves around. There has been guidelines over the time with different service agencies, including police, that had a set period of a couple of days that they shouldn't have. Well, there are kids that are upwards towards several weeks, and I don't believe that's adequate. And I do think that if we can combine a proper system to turn kids around and have adequate detention facilities as well, I think we can certainly reduce the numbers and absolutely reduce the time that people are spending in watch houses.
Would you commit to putting in place a maximum period for children to be detained in watch houses?
Yes, but once the systems are in place to allow that. But in the meantime, my values say to me that a child in a watch house for weeks, I just don't think that's best for society or the child. That ability for that person to turn their life around after an experience like that is much harder than if they get the support and the structure in a detention facility. That I just think there's a bad correlation for individual and society.
So sorry to just keep on going with this point, but I'm just keen to hear from you. If you were to form government after the 26th of October, would you prioritise ending the use of watch houses to detain children?
Yes, it will be a priority, but I can't say to you within 6 months there'll be no kids in watch houses, because if I make a commitment to somebody, I honour it. But I'll make this commitment. There'll be less kids in watch houses by the end of the term than what we're seeing now, and I'm certain that kids will be staying there for a shorter period of time. In a perfect world, children shouldn't be in watch houses, full stop.
So I think even if we follow sort of the themes that emerged in the Northern Territory election in terms of crime and cost of living, would you agree that we're seeing similar?
Queensland is always unique. We're our own state. You know the four issues I've spoken about: youth crime, health, housing, cost of living, and that has transcended the state. And I've been speaking about those problems and the solutions for nearly 4 years. I've seen we obviously watched what happened in the Northern Territory. I know Leah, the new Chief Minister, well. I think she's a very caring and a compassionate person as well. And whilst there was a lot of talk about those big four challenges, I think Territorians and even Australians have seen in her first month of the job that she's not, she's not someone who won't deal with issues in a considered way. And I'd like to think in many ways that's my leadership style as well.
Yeah, she certainly does talk about cost of living being something she does need to prioritise. And I think for Queenslanders, we are facing cost of living and housing crisis together, and we're seeing that play out not just for people who use our services, but also for our workforce itself. And so that's why some of the commitments you've made today are really important. If we go, though, to how the cost of living crisis is impacting people using our services, I do have a question from Kevin Mercer from St Vincent de Paul, and he's pointing to how acute the cost of living crisis is for families with children. And we are releasing our annual living affordability report next week, and it certainly does emphasise that. The question really is, if you were to form government after the 26th of October, what are the things that you would do to alleviate cost of living pressures for families, to cover costs of things like technology, sport, uniforms, excursions, etc.?
Ensure that the short-term measures are there and maintained, and that's important. Queenslanders need to know if government changes that those things that are in place should be there. I speak about things like the Get in the Game vouchers. It's something that's been for some time, and was something that was implemented originally by the former government, continued over a long period of time. I think that's important because if kids get disconnected from playing sport, they get disconnected with community, they're more likely to stay home, become disenfranchised, which is why I've also spoken about kids in residential care as well, having access to it. And we've put a question on notice about that, which we haven't got an answer on. But I think the percentage of children in residential care participating in extracurricular activities and sport is right down, and it's the greatest gift you can give. So that's important. But I'm also committed to dealing with the structural issues that's causing the cost of living pain. And I know that mightn't make good headlines, and it mightn't make a banner that you can stand in front of, but the reason why people are suffering with their electricity is because we just have not been able to manage the way that our electricity generators have run in the state. We haven't been able to manage a sensible transition as part of our need to play a role in climate and have renewable energies. We're not being honest about what storage option looks like. And I've spoken about smaller pumped hydro, which I believe is affordable and achievable. The government's talking about a $26 billion plan that doesn't have any planning approval or traditional owner consent. It doesn't have any true environmental approvals, and yet they're pinning all their hopes on a transition to that. That would make power completely and utterly unaffordable. What I'm offering is a transition to renewables that is. I'm also offering to make sure there's a maintenance guarantee in the short term to get our current power generators working to drive down costs for people. Now, that's the reason why people are hurting so much with their power bill. The reason why our rents have gone up 65% in the last 10 years is because of that supply issue. Now, if we had delivered adequate supply, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The reason why our insurance premiums keep going up is we've had no flood mitigation built at all, no detention basins, no levies, and youth crime has had a direct correlation on your postcode, which has a direct correlation on how much you're paying on your insurance. Or if you're somebody who has been subjected to multiple break-ins, for example, at your business, your excess has gone up. So all of those things, you've got to deal with the structural issues. But cost of living is something that I wouldn't have had one day in the last 2 years where I haven't heard a story directly from someone about it that is different to the one I heard the day before. You know, you talk about the big bills around the table, but the way that it is impacting people, from people with a mortgage to people who are living in social housing, everyone's got a story about it. And, you know, I use the example of fuel, of petrol stations. The solution around that is not for the state government to try and have a state servo which will kill out the competition in the market. The way to do that is to make sure that you've got world-class roads so people aren't stuck in traffic, idling, paying for fuel that they're not using. That's the state government's responsibility. So that's, you know, our focus is on dealing with the structural issues, and if we do it in a mature and considered fashion, I think we can make a difference. But in the short-term decision is around that support, and that support is essential.
So am I hearing you say that beyond the current investment that's been made on cost of living sort of short-term relief, if into the next year the inflation hasn't come down to an extent that, you know, the cost of living is reduced, that you would consider extending those rebates and concessions that we saw?
And I use public transport as an example. When the government said it was embarking on that trial, and it was a 6-month trial, I said, yeah, okay, let's do that. Let's have a look at what the affordability element does. We should also, as part of that 6-month trial, and why 6 months is a good window in time is it transcends a few seasons, you also have a look at, do we need more frequency to make it attractive to get people on? Do we need more reliability, i.e. is it a time thing that gets people more likely to take public transport? Is safety an issue? Do you need to have a greater safety perception to get people to use it? All of those things have to be put into your matrix to determine what is the best way to get people on public transport, and if you put all those together, you might have a way of genuinely having public transport that is used by a greater portion of the people, and financially that makes sense. So that's why we said we'd support that trial. Well, and I won't stand in the way of any cost of living relief, but the difference what I'm offering is to deal with these underlying issues so that the state can be in a strong position to be able to build the things that we need to build and deliver the services that we need to deliver.
I have another cost of living question from a member. So it's Damien Foley, the CEO of The Wine. He's talking about the record number of school breakfasts that they've been delivering in the last year. And keen to know from you what your view is of providing kids with a breakfast program, particularly in public schools.
Very fond of it, and I see the organisations and many of the community sector groups as being the vehicle to do it. I know there are a lot of organisations who are doing it already and doing it off their own steam. It's a good way to do a couple of things. It's a good way to make sure that kids are listening and learning. It's also, in many cases, might be the difference with a child turning up. That might be the excuse to get them to go to school. I know there's a school in the Gold Coast, Men of Business Academy, which Marco's become a good friend. I've just missed a phone call from him, so I will call you back, mate, I promise, if you're watching. But he has this rule that every morning he feeds the boys when they turn up, grade 10, 11, 12, and once a week they cook for each other and serve each other. And he said to me that many of those boys have never sat at a table and had a meal as a family unit, which, it's a foreign concept for me. Like, to have someone get to the age of 15 and never have sat down and shared a meal and prepared and cooked for others, you can, back to our earlier conversation, where food sits in the pecking order of my interest. That to me is troubling. So I think there's an argument for that to be available at school.
There's something very profound as well about service too, isn't there? Food preparation and service.
It's humbling. It shows that you're equal. You count for something, and if done well, it's a great part of life.
So another question from one of our wonderful members, John O'Malley, who's the Executive Officer of Financial Counsellors Association of Queensland. And I don't know if you've met John, but he is a massive champion for financial counsellors across Queensland. And he points often to the fact that we have the least financial counsellors in per capita in the country in Queensland. He's been advocating very hard for additional resources to go toward financial counsellors, and keen to know what your view of the importance of financial counsellors are and whether that would be something you might look at.
Very important for individuals, for businesses. I am mindful that the federal government does provide quite a number of hotlines. There are individuals who are attached to the federal government who go into the field. I'm not cognizant of whether or not Queensland has its share from the Commonwealth or not. I'll take John, if he's an expert in the sector, that if Queensland isn't doing the heavy lifting, I think we do. We have a desire after a disaster to do it well, through things like the Reconstruction Authority, and I think that's important. But it is also important that we're there outside of the disaster period. I've always seen it more as something that was driven out of Canberra, but I'll if John's got some details, let's chat.
I hope you heard that, John.
Thank you, John.
So I guess another thing that we've talked about over the years, which struck me as something that you appeared to be pretty personally committed to or interested in, is women's economic security and participation in the workforce. So, here in Queensland, still to this day, despite women attaining higher education at a higher rate, we still have a lower participation in the workforce, lower wages, lower superannuation balances. And I think this is particularly of importance to our sector. We are a feminised workforce. About 80% of our workers are women. And I know that this is something you've thought a lot about in terms of participation in particular. What are the sorts of things that you want to do on that front?
Well, firstly, the facts. I think our gender pay gap in Queensland, I think it's in the top 2 at the wrong end of the spectrum. So it's something we do have to address. I've announced what we're calling a Back to Work program, which is grants of up to $5,000, anything that helps women get back in the workforce. So it might be having to update a CV, buy technology, workwear. Often if somebody leaves to be a carer or have a child, you need new clothes to get back in the workforce. You need transport. So we've announced that, which I think is an exciting package, and I would be surprised if I think it will be embraced, and I think there's opportunities to grow that into the future as well. I guess the other thing I can do is lead by example, and I made a commitment when I became leader that I wanted to see in the 14 most marginal seats, which is the number of seats that we need to win the state election. I said I wanted to see half of those be women. We've finished those now, and of the 14, 10 of those 14 seats are women, with a vast, great professional backgrounds and community sector and people from multicultural backgrounds. And I think that helps. It helps generational change for my side of politics. It also helps send a message about what community leadership looks like. And I know that's only a small way, but it's another step forward in delivering that. And I'm the father of 2 daughters, and that's something that's important to me as a dad. And
David, potentially a cheeky question is around your own leadership team, your own cabinet. Are we likely to see women around you working with you, making key and important decisions for the state?
Well, it's a source of great lament that at the moment in my party room we only have 6 women, and that's why that was so important to me. All 6 of those women are in cabinet, and I can hand on heart say that all 6 of them, they're there on merit, and all 6 of them add an amazing skill set to the team. And if you want to lead, you have to reflect, and that's important. So the short answer is that's why I'm committed to making sure that we get more women into those roles, and to have more women in senior leadership roles, including sitting around the cabinet table. That's important.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the one area we haven't touched on is health, and obviously health is such, even though health sits sort of adjacent to our sector, much of what we do alleviates pressure on the health system. Before we go, can you talk to me a little bit about why health is one of your focus areas and what you want to achieve there?
Because it's one of those services that is broken down, and it's broken down everything from what people see, the ambulances stuck on ramps to what they don't see, the child who's got major mental health anguish, who's unable to leave the bedroom. And health is a real complex area. It's complex because of Queensland's geography, because of some of the failings over a long period of time. I'm not comfortable with the number of maternity wards that have been closed in regional areas. I think that's a key part of the fabric of a community. I was born in one of those country hospitals that's been on and offline many times in recent years, and I want to see mums in regional areas be able to have babies, but I also want to make sure that we don't see. We now have more Queenslanders on the surgery waiting list than we've ever had, and waiting to see the specialist to get on that list as well. And that's a failing of the system. 45% ambulance ramping over the last 6 months, which is highest in the country. That's a failing of the system. So health's important, but it's also the stuff that it's difficult to measure. And I use mental health as the one that I don't believe we've got a handle on properly. There's a levy that we now attach, which has been for a few years now. I don't think there's the transparency around where that gets spent. If you're taking a levy, you owe it to make sure that every single cent of it is spent on what you're collecting it for, but also that you have visibility. And that levy is going to increase over the years. So there's an opportunity, as well as the obvious, that people deserve to get better services with mental health. Don't think there's been visibility on it, and I do think that it needs it, and visibility breeds transparency. So I've spoken about within 100 days of the election, if government was to change, showing data in real time. I think that's important culturally to drive change. Same with something like that. You show where money's being spent, and that's how you drive change.
David, I've got one big question for you before we close, and so I want you to put your creative cap on and imagine into the future and describe for us, should you win the election, what does Premier Crisafulli look like? What can we expect from you as a leader?
Government not to be in your face every minute of the day, government to be calm and considered, services to be focused front and centre of what we do at the moment, projects to be built on time and on budget, a compassionate government that treats people with respect, a government that understands that people will have different views, but that doesn't make them any lesser, and a government that can make sure that the things that have made us great in the past, those industries that have made us great, have a future, but likewise the industries in a new age economy, medical research, higher education, service delivery, that they can have a place in a modern Queensland as well. And I think that's important, and I think what I've tried to do over the last 4 years is show a discipline, but also a different approach, and to try and look and sound different to what people would expect of my side of politics. And I'm 50 days, we'll find out.
We will, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, we're really grateful to you for your generosity with your time right now, but also across the last 4 years. You have always engaged very respectfully with us, given us your time,
Thanks.
Your views. Whether or not we always agree, we can always have a respectful and honest conversation, and we really appreciate that.
And I've valued that too. You've always been upfront, and I've appreciated the opportunity over the years, and thank you for today.
And thanks to everyone who's joined us online today. We will have a session with Premier Stephen Miles in the coming weeks, so do stay tuned. We'll share information about that soon. But for now, have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks again for joining us.